Greetings, loyal listeners and supporters. I know it's been a while, but this is Brian Frydenborg, and I'm back doing my Calling It Like It Is radio show slash podcast. I'm an international affairs, development, and public policy professional, as well as a freelance writer, journalist, consultant, and historian. And today's show, and I promise all of you I'm going to be working hard to keep my shows to about 30 minutes each instead of the marathon 2-hour sessions you may have listened to before. But the topic of today's show is going to be asking a very simple question. Why can't the Middle East take care of ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, depending on your preference, the Islamic State, the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, whatever terminology you prefer, that insane, incredibly murderous Sunni Wahhabist terrorist group operating in the Middle East and causing all kinds of havoc in the region. Why can't the Middle East countries handle this on their own? Why does it apparently seem to have to be a problem that is dealt with and solved by U.S. military might? Why is this the standard mode of thinking for so many in both the Middle East and the United States, that somehow the U.S. needs to be leading and doing most of the work in this fight against this horrid group? And I'm going to start with one of my favorite commentators, who's also a comedian, but I still think when you get past some of the jokes, and I certainly don't always agree with him, he's actually one of the sharpest minds on the left in America, is Bill Maher, who talks about Uncle Sucker constantly being dragged into these conflicts in the Middle East by these governments that don't want to do fighting on their own, that don't want to handle their own problems and want us to solve their problems for them. And he showed this chart which looked at the size of various militaries in the Middle East, and he discussed the fact that the number of ISIS fighters is thought to be way smaller than the combined military might of these different countries in the Middle East. And he said, this is ridiculous. Why do we have to be there? Why do we have to be involved? Why can't they take care of this themselves? And I think he made an incredibly important point, a point that I agree with, which is basically the U.S. should not be leading this fight. It's not primarily our fight. Do we have a stake in seeing this dealt with and seeing a positive outcome and seeing ISIS defeated? Of course. But our stake is so much smaller than the stake of the people whose co-religionists, whose ethnic brothers and sisters, whose neighbors, whose countrymen are being killed by the thousands in the conflict against this group. I'm talking about Middle Easterners. I'm talking about Syrians primarily and Iraqis primarily. I'm talking about Arabs primarily. And I'm talking about Shiite Muslims, Sunni Muslims, but Muslims in general, but not just Muslims, Arab Christians, other groups. The Yazidis, for example, were very famously maltreated by Daesh, including murder and rape and mass sexual enslavement, what have you. There were even aspects of the legal definition of genocide, not in terms of its being successfully carried out, but in terms of the intent to carry out what would legally be determined as genocide, in terms of the ISIS campaign against the Yazidis, which is a different kind of unique, very small religious sect in the region. Now, I'm not going to just take Bill Maher's presentation of the numbers for regional militaries on its face. I mean, he was citing another source, and I love Bill Maher, but he's definitely not an academic. So I decided to look into this situation of how many available troops in the Middle East are there, how many people are really in ISIS, and I think it's important for us to understand these numbers when we discuss what the heck is going on, why is there such a strong call and demand for U.S. involvement in light of these numbers. So let's start there, okay? For one thing, okay, we won't even consider Israel because the idea of these Arab states openly working with Israel, it'd be a great thing. There's certainly a common interest, but it's not going to happen. So let's not even waste our time discussing that. The political impracticalities are just too great. But apart from the Arab states, we're going to be considering Persia and Iran and Turkey, the Turks. For those of you who don't know, and I hope most of you would, the Iranian state is populated mainly by ethnic Persians, a culture that goes back thousands of years. The Turks are Turks. Turks and Persians are different from Arabs. Kurds are also another group. They happen to live in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. They are not ethnically Persian, Arab, or Turkish. They're their own thing. But, all right, so we're going to be talking about these groups, okay? Now, Turkey is the most powerful military in the region, all right? I'm looking at numbers presented by Business Insider here from a series of rankings, looking at very credible intelligence and official numbers published by Global Firepower, all right? Turkey is the strongest military in the region in terms of numbers, active personnel. It's got well over 400,000 or 410,000 something active duty soldiers, okay? It's got almost 1,000 aircraft in its air force, and it has over 3,600 tanks, okay? That's just Turkey. Now, we look at Egypt. They're ranked number 3 in terms of active, they're ranked number 3 overall. Turkey is apparently the most powerful military in the region, followed by Israel. But now we look at Egypt, which is ranked number 3. They've got almost 470,000 active duty troops, over 4,700 tanks, over 1,100 aircraft, okay? Iran has almost 550,000 soldiers in their active duty forces, 2,400 tanks, about 500 aircraft, all right? Saudi Arabia, which actually in 2014, in numbers from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, okay, they have been, for the last couple of years, the number 4 defense budget, okay? They spend almost as much as Russia, which is number 3. We got the U.S. number 1, then China, okay? Saudi Arabia, number 4, okay? They spend more than France and the UK individually, each. Okay, the Saudis do. So they have a very, very well-equipped military, all right, and they have over 230,000 soldiers, over 1,000 tanks, about 700 aircraft, okay? Syria, now we know they've been taking a big beating and fighting a lot, and they obviously have their hands full, hardly with just ISIS, but there's a full-scale civil war going on there. But we should still note they've got almost 180,000 men-at-arms in their military. Obviously, they're taking a lot of casualties, though, so perhaps that number's a bit lower or even significantly lower, but that's still not a small number. They're very well trained and they have a lot of experience at this point. They got almost 5,000 tanks and over close to 400 aircraft. All right. United Arab Emirates comes up next. They've got about 65,000 soldiers, over 500, about 550 tanks, about 450 aircraft. Yemen. All right, we won't even count them because they're in the midst of a civil war right now. But Jordan, very, very well-trained military, well-equipped, 110,000 plus, over 1,300 tanks, and about 250 aircraft. Iraq. All right, officially there's about 271,000 people in the active duty military. They've got over 350 tanks, about 200 aircraft. But I have looked at some numbers which suggests, in light of all the fighting and the horrible losses of the Iraqi army in the face of the ISIS onslaught in 2014 and continuing today, that number is actually a lot slower. One figure coming from the Washington Institute, a Near East policy, which is somewhat, I want to say right wing, but there's definitely kind of a conservative, kind of pro-Israeli bias. I mean, which is not uncommon for a lot of security think tanks in the U.S., I suppose, but or at least a number. But the analysis I looked at from them seemed pretty solid, and they showed that there were a tremendous amount of losses and disintegration of the Iraqi military. So maybe the Iraqi military is down to about 85,000 effective, ready, active duty troops. Although there's been 100,000 plus Shiite militias being thrown into the mix there, and of course there's the Peshmerga, which is probably even better, even though it's not an official military. The Peshmerga I'm talking about is the Kurdish region military, unofficially part of the Iraqi military, but probably more professional and more experienced and better fighters, and they have a large force as well. Perhaps, what was the numbers I saw recently? About 200,000 plus. Actually, sorry, over 100,000 plus there. And then we can even talk about Little Oman, okay? They've got about 72,000 troops, about 200 tanks, 100 aircraft. Their country only has a population of about 4 million, and about half of those, a little under half, are actually expatriates and guest workers. So there's only about 2-something million actual Omanis, and they have an army of 72,000. And we can keep going. There's others. I mean, Lebanon is a pretty large military, over 100,000 for a small country. But then again, their situation is very fragile. There's the whole situation with Hezbollah and the past civil wars, and there's elements of Lebanese forces. At least Hezbollah certainly is involved in Syria very heavily. So we probably shouldn't count Hezbollah here. So if you add all these numbers together, and we're not including Yemen's military because they're caught in the civil war. I am including a few much smaller forces from countries like Qatar and Bahrain and Kuwait. I'm not even going to include Syria's forces, which we should include some of them, but obviously there's a very bad civil war there. So there's about 200,000 troops from Syria I'm not including. But if we include all these other troops, and not even including the Kurds, which are not an official army, okay? It's another at least 100,000 very strong forces, strong soldiers. I'm not including the Shiite militias, okay, which are probably about 100,000 as well. If you just include these active duty militaries that aren't caught in the civil war right now, and you don't include Israel's, in the region you've got over 2 million, about 2,030,000 active duty soldiers. That does not even include reserves. That doesn't include reserves, doesn't include any of these militias, doesn't include informal professional militaries like the Kurds. So that's without reserves, without these other forces. That's over 2 million active duty soldiers. That's over 20,000 tanks, thousands of aircraft, okay? And for something this terrible, because what's happening is terrible with ISIS in Syria, Iraq, and the attacks they're carrying out there, and the massacres and mass enslavement and mass rape, the destruction of amazing ancient sites like Palmyra. I mean, that was just obscene. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people, all right? We can certainly make that number much higher, including reserves, including the Kurdish Peshmerga, but that's still 2 million active duty soldiers backed by thousands of, over 20,000 tanks, thousands of planes, okay? And what are we looking at as far as ISIS and their numbers? Well, last fall, the CIA put out a range of estimates that went from a little under 20,000 to a little bit over 30,000 as far as their fighters. And the point is, they're not very big. And that's the statistic Bill Maher site. But however, I think it's important to acknowledge that we might have been off on that, because apparently we've killed about 10,000 ISIS and ISIS-affiliated people with our airstrike campaign with a number of our Arab allies and Western allies. The Arab allies, frankly, aren't doing that much, and there's numbers out there that back that up if you'd like to look at that. It's mainly the U.S., and even the rest of the strikes are mainly Western allies that are carrying them out. But, we've killed about 10,000 ISIS people, apparently, okay? So if they really only have 20,000 to 30,000 people, if we took out half to a third of their strength, we would see a tremendous decrease in their capability, and they'd be losing a lot of territory very quickly. And that has not been the case. And what that suggests is that 20 to 30,000 is a bit off. And I was looking at some interesting analysis from NPR and a website called War on the Rocks. War on the Rocks in particular points out that the Islamic State, ISIS, is controlling roughly 6 plus to 7 million plus civilians between the areas they control in Syria and Iraq. Now, this was some months ago, back in February, but there's not been a dramatic change in the situation since then. So they're controlling about 6 million people. They have to provide security there, and they're able to draw on those manpowers, but just on those populations for manpower. But just controlling that number of people means they probably have more. It's almost certain they would have more than 30,000 security personnel. That could be like police types of border control. These aren't the top military forces with special training and lots of experience, okay? But they're still able to field a lot more people. Granted, a lot of these people are going to be raw conscripts being forced to fight against their will, who will break and run very quickly. But the idea that we're only fighting 20,000 to 30,000 ISIS seems off. It could be significantly more. It could be a lot more. There are some estimates that put the entire number of personnel involved in military operations for ISIS, including support personnel, including conscripts, including affiliated militias, because there are militias that have aligned Islamist extremists and others who have aligned with ISIS and are fighting side by side with them. Could be as many as 200,000. That's probably too high in my book. There are other estimates that go as low as 50,000, higher to 100,000. But even if it's 200,000, obviously that's going to be a lot harder to deal with. But again, only a small portion of that 200,000 or even 100,000 are going to be real hardcore Islamist ISIS fighters, not conscripts, not support staff, not affiliated militias, okay? My own experience looking at this type of stuff probably puts the real effective fighting, and we can include support staff. Let's not include affiliated militias. So sometimes those affiliates will change and switch sides, and they can be co-opted. But just Daesh itself, maybe 50,000. I would say probably not more than 100,000. I'm not going to include the border and police types. They're not really going to be involved in combat in effective ways. The raw conscripts, probably not either when push comes to shove. Okay? So we're talking 50 to maybe upwards of 100,000. I saw, the best analysis I saw said certainly closer to 100,000 than 30,000. I can believe that, but closer to doesn't mean that they have exactly 100,000, okay? But closer to 100 than 30, I can believe that. Even if we say, okay, our estimates have been way off, that's still 2 million active duty, fairly well-equipped soldiers, okay? For Iraq's number, I put the low ball number, not the higher number of 270 plus thousand, but I put a lower ball number of about 85,000, okay? But that's still 2 million active duty soldiers not involved in fighting civil wars in Syria right now. But obviously the Syrian soldiers could be very involved in this fight with ISIS. Not including them, not including Yemeni troops. That's a lot. And it's just, to me, I'm going to stick with Bill Maher's original point and say he's right. It's ridiculous. It's really ridiculous that these often well-equipped soldiers who often have Western, U.S. produced equipment, we're talking F-16s, tanks that we make, guns, whatever, they're not fighting with just AKs and old rifles here, okay? They're well-equipped. And in the case of Jordan and other countries, they're quite well-trained. Turkey, quite well-trained. This is happening in their neighborhoods, okay? Turkey has seen Islamic State attacks in Turkish territory, killing Turkish civilians, okay? We've seen attacks spreading throughout the region. They'd love to get into places like Jordan. They haven't so far been successful, but they've certainly been trying. These are Muslims, Arabs being killed in the thousands by ISIS. And I really just can't understand for the life of me how these militaries can't squash wherever it is, 50,000, 30,000, 100,000, how they have not been able to come together and really just deal with this problem. And the truth of the matter is, these countries would rather treat the Syrian people, the Iraqi people and their territory as chess pieces in a big chessboard for them to play out their regional, petty, tribal, ethnic, sectarian rivalries out against each other. They would rather have this conflict go on as a way to weaken rivals. And to me, that's honestly a disgrace. We hear all this talk from here about how Muslims and Arabs are oppressed by the West and this and that. But when push comes to shove, this region does not seem to have the leaders and the governments capable or even desiring of coming together to overcome shared problems. Okay? Because Iraq and Syria are on the borders of almost all these places I'm talking about. Not Egypt. Egypt's a bit further away, but then again, ISIS has been operating now in the Sinai Peninsula and been killing scores of Egyptian soldiers, and that's been getting worse. The idea that not even including some of these militaries, giving lower estimates and not including reserves, that 2 million active duty soldiers with over 20,000 tanks and thousands of aircraft. That's not even including the U.S. and Western support, which has been very robust here, okay? The idea that the U.S. is going to be putting a lot of troops on the ground to do this is silly. It's not going to happen. The American people seem to not really have an appetite for that. Maybe if things get worse. I know that there's been a growth in that option being considered feasible in America, but still not a dominant view. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and I'm really sorry to say that the shame is not on the U.S. for doing more. The Republicans in America who are screaming about Obama being weak and not doing more, I'm sorry, but Obama's right on. Okay? Some people try to portray his stance, his strategy is leading from behind, and they use that phrase in a very disdainful way. Some people try to portray the situation as, Obama simply wants to do no harm, and it's definitely not that. What he's trying to do is show that the U.S. is there to support, the U.S. is there to aid and help our allies fight the conflicts in their backyards that are threatening their people. We're there to help, we're there to support. We're not there to do it for you, we're not there to lead. There seriously does seem to be this regional dynamic that's been going on for quite some time now, where the necessary political and social moves that these governments need to make to accommodate legitimately aggrieved populations, okay, we're talking the Sunni minorities, the Kurdish minorities, the Shiite minorities, what have you, instead of just playing for maximum advantage and oppressing these people and trying to just smash them into submission and doing nothing to address their legitimate political grievances, social grievances, and then letting things blow out of proportion to a point where you have civil wars and things get crazy, where you have a civil war now in Syria, you almost had civil wars in Iraq at several points, you have the civil war in Yemen. Are you telling me that Yemen, which is about half Shia, that the Houthis and others could not have been reasonably accommodated in the past, and some kind of power sharing arrangement couldn't have been arranged so that we'd be avoiding this kind of Shia-Sunni civil war there? Are you telling me that the Assad regime couldn't have done a much better job of addressing its people's desire for more freedom and less oppression, that the Sunnis there, largely rising up against a minority Shiite-dominated government, Assad Shiite, he's Alawi, the Alawites are a Shiite subsect of Islam. They're a subsect of Shia Islam, I should say. Are you telling me that Maliki, when he was in Iraq, could not have done something from the time when we left, when we had gotten the Sunnis in Anbar province to side with us? Okay, are you telling me that Maliki and other Shia leaders couldn't have done something to accommodate the very legitimate grievances that the Sunnis had there, that the Kurds had there, to bring the country together? Instead, just before ISIS attacked in 2014, by the end of 2013, there was a full-blown insurgency of the Sunni tribesmen in Anbar rising against Maliki's Shiite government. Are you telling me that these leaders couldn't have done a better job, and that then they're begging for U.S. involvement as their solution? I mean, come on. What Obama did right in Iraq, and deserves a lot of credit for, is he said to Maliki, we're not going to be there to justify your sectarian, oppressive policies against the Kurdish and Sunni minorities. If you do not adjust your policies, you'll be getting no help from us. And if Iraq, you want help from us, you're going to have to get him to change his ways or find someone new. And he refused to change his ways, and now we have relatively far more accommodating Shia leader in Dr. Haider al-Abadi, who is trying to take in the considerations and the needs and desires of the Kurds and Sunnis much more than Maliki did, in trying to tamp down this conflict. But at that point, ISIS already controlled a huge portion of Iraq. So we're dealing with this situation, and everyone's saying, on the right in America, the Republicans, oh, Obama needs to do more. Maybe not everybody, but certainly that's the general vibe that's being expressed. Obama should be doing more. America needs to do more. It's our responsibility. It's our fight. No, it's not. Very few Americans have been killed or targeted in these situations. Okay? It's almost all Middle Eastern, Sunnis, Shias, Arabs, Kurds, Turks, Persians, Muslims, Middle Easterners. They're the ones fighting and dying in this situation. And they're the ones who are not uniting. They're the ones who are playing regional rivalries. They're the ones who are playing for sectarian and ethnic and tribal gains. I'm telling you, if the Kurds came together with the Persians, the Iranians, okay, if they came together with the Turks, if the Gulf countries united, if Jordan and Iraq and all these countries could unite, they could squash ISIS. They could squash this. They could end the killing. They could end the enslavement. They could end the massacres and rape and the destruction of the great cultural heritage of the Middle East. All this could end. And I can tell you, if they would unite, the U.S. would be there for them. We'd be there with their support. We'd be there for logistics. We'd be there with money. We'd be there with diplomatic support. So would our Western allies. So would other countries in the world. Okay? Right now, it's the other way around. The U.S. is leading these strikes. The U.S. is leading the campaign against ISIS. Most of the fighting is being done by the Kurds and the Iraqis and the Syrians on their own. And we practically have to beg these other countries to be involved. And even when they are, the vast majority of the strikes are carried out by the U.S. and the vast majority of the rest of the strikes are carried out by Western allies and not local allies. We've only just seen Turkey take an active role. For goodness sakes. I mean, what are they doing, to be honest? Seriously, what are they doing? And they're focusing more on attacking the Kurds, who should be their allies in this situation. Put aside their differences for now and unite against ISIS. I mean, how hard is it? Really? Yeah, I understand there's issues, but really, this is a major, major threat in terms of their stability and their people coming from Daesh. And it's been festering for an obscenely long amount of time for such a small terrorist group turned mini-state. And to me, we're asking the wrong questions. Oh, why isn't the U.S. doing this? Why isn't the U.S. doing that? Why isn't the West doing this? And it's the same thing with the refugee situation, mind you. Small countries like Jordan and Lebanon, together with Turkey, have taken on almost the entire burden of hosting these refugees from Syria and Iraq. The Gulf countries have taken pretty much nobody in. Yeah, they're throwing some money, but why aren't they taking anybody? Why are we talking about, oh, Germany and Europe should be taking in more? And that may be true. The U.S. should be taking more. That may also be true. But wow, what are these really rich Gulf countries doing? Almost nothing. They have taken literally almost no refugees. It might actually be 0 refugees, but it's either close to 0 or 0 from what I was just reading. It's just ridiculous. The Middle East needs to grow up, as Bill Maher is talking. They need to take the training wheels off, and part of that is the U.S.'s fault. We've been intervening so often and too often to the point that if I'm a political leader in the U.S. who's lazy and doesn't feel like being brave, or anybody like a Nelson Mandela, I'm going to say, oh well, the U.S. has bailed us out in the past. If we just sit on our hands and do nothing, the U.S. will come in again. They'll spend their money. They'll risk their troops, and we'll be okay. You know, it's kind of like Israel's approach to Iran. They really don't want to do anything that's going to bring about some kind of peace agreement, normalization of relations, or an understanding. They are pursuing a very confrontational approach to Iran that either leaves Iran with the option to completely surrender their sovereignty and nuclear program 100%, or there's going to be a war, military strikes. And obviously Israel, a small country, won't be bearing the burden and the higher proportion of those strikes. They're looking to get the U.S. involved there in that. And that's just not the solution for this region. They've got to figure out their own problems and look to us for help, but not look to us to solve them for them, to be the movers and shakers in addressing these problems. And it's a sad situation. I'm not optimistic. If we look at this situation in Yemen, where there's a civil war, the Houthis are a really ragtag bunch. I mean, maybe they're getting some support from Iran, maybe Hezbollah, but you know, you have a very strong air coalition, and they've been able to draw almost the entire Sunni Muslim world from Pakistan to Morocco into supporting these operations against the Shiite rebels, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. But it's a very sloppy operation. It's been very incompetent. The few thousand ground troops that have gone in now, they're having problems. There's a humanitarian catastrophe. We're talking about famine conditions, people on the verge of starvation, and not just a huge portion of Yemen's population. This is Saudi Arabia, arguably the leader of the Arab world and the Sunni world in that region. They're leading this intervention, and we can talk about how bad America's intervention in Iraq was, but my goodness, we didn't have a vast majority of the country on the verge of starvation after a few months of involvement. And I recognize that Yemen was a very poor country to begin with, but that is something that the Saudi planners needed to take into account. So even with Yemen and them trying to squash this situation there, look at how incompetent the Arab world is and the Sunni Muslim community is in dealing with this situation. Look at how bad a job they're doing with Yemen. So maybe it's no wonder that it wouldn't necessarily follow that it would be a great outcome if they led and there was a very large Arab allied and Turkish and an Iranian joint task force. But still, ultimately the responsibility really is with them. And I hope they can learn some lessons from their misadventures right now in Yemen. To me, that's a situation that cries out for a diplomatic solution. You have a very aggrieved Shiite population, and if they were being treated better, you wouldn't have this civil war right now, at least the way it's unfolding. It wouldn't be happening. And that's all I really have to say, is that you look at those numbers, even if you allow for the fact that the U.S. Underestimated ISIS fighters, and there's a lot more, close to 100,000, still, all these countries together have no excuse for not having ended this already and not having act in the interest of their Muslim brothers and sisters, of their fellow Arabs, of their fellow Shiites, of their fellow Sunnis. If you add those categories together, that's enough reason for an alliance between Turkey and Iran and the Arab states to deal with this. And they can and they should, and it's their responsibility. And the people, whether it's Republicans in the U.S. or others, that are suggesting that it's the U.S.'s responsibility and that we should be taking the lead. Well, you know what that means? That means 5 years from now when the next problem comes up, or 10 years, or whatever it is, the leaders are all just going to sit on their hand, say, let's not spend our money, let's not risk our personnel. The U.S. will come back in and do it for us again, as they've done almost every time. And they don't know the region as well as us. They make a lot of mistakes. They cause other problems, but we'll just keep letting that happen. That is the dynamic, ultimately, that needs to change. Anyway, that's the end of this podcast. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your thoughts. Hope you're all doing well. Stay safe out there.